Have you ever wondered what would happen if, after the departure of a loved one, an unexpected message emerged to change everything? Gale, a grandson who carries the pain of losing his grandfather Teodoro, finds a letter that was lost in time. Upon opening it, he is thrown into a whirlwind of emotions, discovering secrets that could transform the way he sees his family, and perhaps, even his life. This story is not just about the revelation of a hidden past. It is a journey of self-discovery and reconciliation, where pain becomes a bridge to healing and understanding. Come with us and discover how this letter could be the key to a new beginning. If you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe now, and be part of our community. Gale always cherished the memories of the days spent at his grandfather Teodoro's house. From a very young age, he would run through the corridors of the old red brick house, hearing the sound of the trees swaying in the wind and smelling the fragrance of the flowers growing in the garden, lovingly tended by his grandfather. It was in that garden that they spent most of their time together. Gale would always ask Teodoro about the plants, the birds singing around them, and about life. Teodoro was a man of few words, but when he spoke, each word seemed to carry years of wisdom. He never needed much to teach Gale. The lessons came disguised in simple conversations, in small actions. For example, when he pruned the rose bushes, he explained to his grandson that sometimes it was necessary to cut away what was old and sick so that new flowers could grow. Gale, still a boy, did not fully understand what this meant, but those words remained in his heart, waiting for the right moment to make sense. Summer afternoons were especially magical. They would sit in an old rocking chair while Teodoro told stories of his youth, tales of courage, adventures he lived when he was young, and people who had passed through his life. For Gale, his grandfather was almost a hero, an unshakable figure, always with a new story to tell, always with a lesson hidden between the lines. Once, while gathering ripe apples from a tree growing in the corner of the garden, Teodoro looked deeply into Gale's eyes and said, "You know, boy, life is like this tree. Sometimes we need to wait for the right time to pick the fruit, and other times we need to plant the seeds, even if we can't see what will grow." Gale, not fully understanding, smiled, but that phrase was etched in his memory, along with the smell of the freshly picked apples. These seemingly simple moments were shaping Gale's view of the world. He grew up believing that the good things in life came with patience, hard work, and above all, love. His relationship with his grandfather was the foundation of all this. Even as he entered his teenage years, and life became busier with studies and friends, Gale always made time to visit his grandfather. The conversations changed, but the affection and respect between them remained the same. However, life with its surprises suddenly changed everything. At 25 years old, Gale no longer visited his grandfather as frequently. Adulthood was in full swing: college, his first job, the new challenges of life, and although he knew Teodoro would still be in the same garden, sitting in the rocking chair, with his wise smile and hands marked by time, Gale always promised himself he would go next week. But, as often happens, the next week never came. Then, on a gray morning, the phone rang, bringing news that paralyzed Gale. Teodoro had passed away suddenly in his sleep. Gale's world stopped. The pain that washed over him was not only from the loss of his grandfather but from guilt. He hadn't had the chance to say goodbye, to thank him for everything, to make those last visits he always postponed. There were so many things he wished he had said, so many conversations they had not had. Gale found himself engulfed in a deep sense of emptiness, as if a part of him had been torn away and there was no way to fill it. On the day of the funeral, he was surrounded by family, yet felt incredibly alone. The sound of others' comforting words made no sense to him. Nothing seemed sufficient to ease that pain. Looking at the closed coffin, knowing that behind that would lay the person who had taught him the most about life, was unbearable. Tears streamed down his face, but he didn't know if he was crying for the loss, or for the regret of not having been there in the last moments. The following days were a blur of memories, with Gale wandering through Teodoro's now silent house, feeling his presence in every corner. The scent of the flowers in the garden, the old hat hanging by the door, the distant sound of the wind rocking the rocking chair. Everything brought a nostalgia that crushed his chest. It was in the midst of this pain that, one afternoon, the postman arrived. Among the routine letters of bills and advertisements, there was a yellowed envelope with handwriting that Gale would recognize anywhere. His heart raced. It was a letter from Teodoro, written shortly before his death. Gale's hands trembled as he held the envelope. His mind raced, trying to understand how this was possible. A letter from someone who was already gone? He hesitated to open it, as if that piece of paper were the last tangible connection to his grandfather, and opening it would mean facing something he was not ready to know. After a few minutes, finally, with a mix of fear and curiosity, Gale opened the envelope. The first words were familiar, almost as if he were hearing his grandfather's voice in his head. "My dear Gale, if you are reading this, it means I have already departed. But there is something I need to tell you. Something I couldn't say in life." Gale felt a shiver run down his spine. What did his grandfather have to reveal? After receiving the mysterious letter from his grandfather Teodoro, who had passed away 6 months earlier, Gale hesitated. The envelope lay on his desk, but he had been unable to open it right away. The impact of the loss was still fresh, and the unexpected arrival of this letter only brought to light more questions than answers. During the first few days, Gale limited himself to looking at the letter, lacking the courage to read it. Something inside him prevented him from opening it, perhaps the fear of confronting a truth he was not prepared to face. His grandfather had been his mentor, a true hero in his life, and the thought of discovering something that could change that terrified him. But something intrigued him deeply. The letter was dated 1 week before Teodoro's passing. How could the correspondence have been delayed for so long? This only deepened the mystery, but at the same time, it brought back memories of those afternoons filled with conversation between the two, when Teodoro always said that time has a way of bringing answers when we least expect it. So finally, on a rainy afternoon, Gale decided he could not postpone any longer. He needed to know what his grandfather had to say. Sitting at the kitchen table, with raindrops tapping against the window, he took a deep breath and began to carefully open the envelope. Inside, a sheet of paper was folded with Gale's name written at the top, in the same familiar handwriting, firm and careful. As he unfolded the letter, Gale began to read what his grandfather had written, unaware that the content of those words would lead him down a path of discoveries he could never have predicted. Gale took a deep breath before starting to read. The paper in his hands felt heavier than it actually was, as if the letter carried an emotional weight he still did not understand. He slid his eyes over the first words, recognizing the affectionate and familiar tone of Teodoro. It was as if his grandfather were there, sitting beside him, speaking directly to him, just as he always had. "My dear Gale, if you are reading this, then several months have passed since I departed. I didn't want you to be left without answers or to carry the burden of the questions that I know must have arisen. I always said I had stories to tell you, but perhaps I didn't have enough time to share them all." That introduction was enough to bring a lump to Gale's throat. The words echoed a closeness he missed so much, but there was something more. A promise of revelations, a weight in the subtext, as if that letter were much more than a farewell. He continued reading, and soon the shock came. Teodoro began to talk about aspects of his life that Gale had never imagined. Small secrets, difficult choices, decisions he had made in the past that, for one reason or another, he had always kept silent about. "There is something I never told anyone," the letter said. "When I was your age, I made a choice that changed the course of my life and our family. I never thought it would be relevant to tell, but now I see that I need you to know." Gale's hands began to tremble slightly. What could he have hidden? Throughout his life, his grandfather had always been an example of honesty, someone Gale trusted completely. What could be so significant that he never told even his own family? The next words in the letter revealed the secret. Teodoro spoke of a trip he had taken decades earlier, an impulsive decision that led him to live away from the family for a time. He revealed that, during that period, he had another life with other people, and that there was someone very important, someone that, until that moment, Gale and the rest of the family had been unaware of. It was a story of love lost in time, a connection from the past that he had never managed to reclaim but that had marked his soul. Gale was in shock. His grandfather, always so close, had carried this secret for so long? A second life, a forgotten love? It was as if he were reading about a completely different person, yet at the same time it was still his grandfather's handwriting, the man who had raised him and whom he admired so much. The initial shock gave way to deep curiosity. Who was this mysterious person? Why had his grandfather kept this secret for so long? And most importantly, what would Gale do with this new information? Gale could hardly believe what he was reading. Teodoro's words in the letter were like a portal to a past he could never have imagined. Each sentence revealed hidden layers of his grandfather's life, a man he had always thought he knew so well. But there, on that aging sheet of paper, was a truth that shocked him profoundly. Teodoro had made a mistake in his youth, a mistake driven by pride that not only affected his life but also the generations that came after. The letter continued. When I was young, I made a decision that I regret every day of my life. There was someone very important to me, someone I loved deeply, but out of stubbornness and pride, I let that person go. I thought I could move on, that time would heal everything, but I was wrong. Gale felt a lump in his throat as he imagined the weight his grandfather had carried in silence for so many years. He had always seen Teodoro as a wise man, with firm words and advice that shaped his life. But there, before his eyes, the grandfather revealed a vulnerability Gale had never known existed. He admitted to a mistake that, in some way, had resonated through time and affected even the subsequent generations. This person I pushed away, the letter continued, was someone you have never heard of, but who was present in my life during pivotal moments. What I did separated us, and I never had the courage to correct my mistake. However, I have always wondered what might have happened if I had acted differently. Gale was paralyzed for a moment. Who was this person? How could someone so important be completely erased from the family's history? His heart raced and his mind tried to piece together the puzzle, even though none of the pieces seemed to fit. Teodoro also wrote about how this separation not only hurt him deeply, but also shaped the family's future in ways he had never anticipated. My pride not only kept me away from that person, but it also prevented our lives from intertwining again. As a result, a part of me became trapped in the past, and that shadow followed our family in ways you may begin to perceive now. The revelation that this mistake had influenced the entire trajectory of the family weighed heavily on Gale's shoulders. What was his grandfather trying to say? Was everything he knew about his own history based on a misguided decision from the past? Each word was a new layer of doubts arising in his mind, creating more questions than answers. But what left Gale even more intrigued was the fact that, until that moment, he had no idea who this person was that his grandfather had mentioned. He had never heard of anyone being estranged from Teodoro. Was there an even greater secret behind these words? Before continuing to read, Gale paused for a moment, observing the handwriting that seemed to have been written with such care, as if Teodoro knew this would be the last chance he had to speak to him. The truth was that this letter had reached him unexpectedly, and the words it contained were about to change everything. He knew he needed to continue. He needed to understand how far this confession would take him, and what else he could discover about the past of his beloved grandfather. But, as he held the letter in his hands, something inside Gale told him that this journey was just beginning. And so, with every line read, Gale drew closer to a revelation that would forever change his perception of family and Teodoro's legacy. Gale read the words in the letter and felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He had an uncle, a brother of Teodoro with whom his grandfather had severed ties decades ago. The name Salvador seemed to echo in his mind, a name that had never been mentioned in his family, but which was now revealed as a fundamental part of his history. The idea that someone so close, yet so distant, had lived without anyone knowing of his existence profoundly shook Gale. Teodoro wrote with a tone of regret, as if he were finally ready to confess the pain he had carried for so many years. Salvador and I were inseparable in our youth, the letter said. We shared everything, dreams, hopes, and even fears. But pride separated us, and it was my stubbornness that drove us apart forever. Gale could barely imagine what might have happened between the two brothers to cause such a rift. His grandfather, always so wise and balanced, had hidden such a deep secret that seemed impossible to believe. How could Teodoro, who had so often advised Gale on the value of family, have kept this estrangement a secret for so long? The letter continued. I thought time would heal the wounds, that one day he would return and we could pick up where we left off. But that day never came, and my pride wouldn't let me go after him. Years passed, and the chasm between us only grew. Salvador left, moved to a distant city, and our lives took opposite paths. Since then, I have not heard anything about him. Gale felt a mix of sadness and anger growing within him. How could his grandfather keep something so important a secret? How could he allow pride to destroy such an essential bond? Now, Gale not only carried the weight of Teodoro's loss, but also the revelation of an uncle he had never known he had. "Why didn't you ever tell us, Grandpa?" Gale murmured to himself, imagining the pain Teodoro must have felt writing those words. It was as if the grandfather were finally trying to make peace with the past, even if it were too late to fix what had been broken. Gale closed his eyes for a moment, trying to process everything. The idea that there was a family member he had never known, someone who might fill a void he hadn't even realized existed, was overwhelming. He didn't know how to react. A mix of curiosity and fear consumed him. Where was Salvador now? Would he still be alive? What had his life been like away from the family? And most importantly, did he know about Gale's existence, or had he also been living in darkness, unaware that he had nephews, grandchildren, and a family waiting for him? The letter continued with Teodoro expressing his deepest regrets. "I know that by hiding this from you, I may have made things worse. But I hope that somehow you can find Salvador. I hope there is a chance for you to fix what I could not." These words struck Gale deeply. The responsibility of discovering Salvador's whereabouts felt like a sudden and almost impossible mission. He had no idea where to begin, nor did he even know if Salvador was still alive. But one thing was certain: the mystery could not remain unanswered. His grandfather, even after his death, was entrusting him with something grand, something that would forever change the dynamics of his family. Gale stood there, motionless, with the letter in his hands, feeling the weight of the past fall upon his shoulders. He knew he needed to do something. He could not let this story end in silence, as his grandfather had done. The search for Salvador would be his way of honoring Teodoro's legacy, of reclaiming the missing part of the story. But at the same time, the fear of the unknown made him hesitate. With his eyes fixed on the letter, Gale understood that the next stage of his life would be to delve into this hidden story. He could not let this opportunity slip away, as it might be his only chance to meet the lost uncle and gain a deeper understanding of his grandfather's heart. And so, with his mind filled with questions and his heart heavy with emotion, Gale knew he was just beginning a journey that would change everything. Gale stared at the letter in his hands, his fingers gently squeezing the already crumpled paper, while his gaze was lost on a fixed point on the wall. The weight of what he had just discovered made his head spin. His heart, caught between Teodoro's past and an uncertain future with Salvador, beat irregularly. He knew he was facing a choice that could change the course of his life. But what should he do? Teodoro, in his confession, had asked for forgiveness, but he also left an implicit request: to find Salvador. It was as if his grandfather wanted to give the family a second chance, a chance he had not had the courage to seek in life. However, Gale knew that following this path could mean reopening old wounds, bringing to light emotions that perhaps his family was not prepared to confront. The first question that came to Gale's mind was, should I really search for Salvador? Should he respect what his grandfather chose in the past and leave this secret buried? Or should he open the doors to a new chapter in his family's history? Each possibility carried immense weight. On one hand, there was the idea of leaving the past where it was, honoring the silence Teodoro had maintained for decades. Perhaps his grandfather had his reasons for keeping Salvador away. Who was Gale to question that? After all, he had known Teodoro as a wise and kind man, always concerned with the family and everyone's well-being. Could that same man have made a wrong decision by cutting ties with his brother? It was a doubt that gnawed at Gale. On the other hand, curiosity burned within him. The desire to meet Salvador, to understand the other half of this story, was something he could not ignore. What could have happened between the two brothers? What kind of person would Salvador be? And more importantly, did he also harbor resentments toward Teodoro? Gale felt compelled to seek these answers, but he knew that doing so could trigger deep emotions not only within himself but throughout his entire family. He rose from the table, pacing back and forth in the small room, as if movement could help him organize his thoughts. The words of the letter echoed in his mind like a silent plea. I hope there is a chance for you to fix what I could not. Those words, simple yet full of meaning, pressed on him. Teodoro believed Gale could find a path to reconciliation, something he had failed to achieve. But there was a risk. What if Salvador did not want to be found? What if contacting him brought more pain than healing? Gale was in a dilemma. He knew that any choice he made would have a profound impact. If he decided to leave everything as it was, life would go on, but that doubt would never leave his mind. He would always wonder, what if? However, if he chose to search for Salvador, he might be opening a Pandora's box, revealing secrets and resentments that could not be easily resolved. Gale sighed, sitting back down, staring at the letter as if he expected it to provide the answers he sought. But the paper, already yellowed with age, remained still, its words fixed like a silent reminder that time waits for no one. With his gaze lost on the horizon, Gale remembered something his grandfather used to say. Life is made of difficult decisions, and each choice we make defines us. That phrase, which had once seemed simple, now carried an entirely new weight. Gale knew this was one of those choices that would define him. Should I search for Salvador? The question echoed in his mind like an insistent note, a song that wouldn't leave his thoughts. Gale did not want to rush, but at the same time, he knew he could not postpone this decision forever. Every second that passed seemed to increase the pressure. He closed his eyes for a moment, seeking clarity that seemed elusive. Deep down, Gale knew that regardless of what Teodoro desired, he needed to follow what his heart was telling him. And at that moment, Gale's heart was crying out for answers. He opened his eyes, staring at the horizon through the window. It was not just curiosity. It was the need to understand, to seek the truth, to know this part of his history that had been hidden for so long. He knew that finding Salvador might not bring him the peace he sought, but he also knew he could not move forward without at least trying. And so, without hesitation, Gale decided he would search for Salvador. The fear and doubts were still there, but he felt this was the only way to find the answers he was seeking, and perhaps to finally gain a better understanding of his own family's history. With the decision made, Gale felt a different weight on his shoulders. He did not yet know what the future held, but he was ready to face whatever came, prepared to deal with the consequences of his choice. After all, this was the only way to honor Teodoro's memory, and perhaps to build a new connection with someone he never imagined existed. With his heart pounding with determination, Gale set out in search of Salvador, resolved to unravel the mysteries that had been buried for so long in his family. Teodoro's letter was now his compass, and every written word seemed to resonate in his mind like an urgent call. He knew this journey would not be easy, however, he was willing to face any challenge that came his way. Gale's first stop was the attic of his grandfather's house, a place he had not visited in years. The dim light from the flickering bulbs cast shadows as he climbed the stairs, and a smell of dust lingered in the air. The stacked boxes were like dusty treasures, each holding fragments of the family's history. He began to open them one by one, his mind eager for clues that would help him find Salvador. After some time, Gale found an old diary belonging to Teodoro. The pages were yellowed, but the handwriting was still legible. He flipped through the pages quickly until something caught his eye, a black and white photograph of a man with a warm smile, whom he immediately recognized as his grandfather in his youth. Next to it was a note. Salvador, 1975. It was as if Teodoro were looking at him, inviting him to follow the path that had been laid out decades ago. With the photograph in hand, Gale noticed that there was an address written on the back in a different handwriting, which appeared more hurried. He wondered if this could be where Salvador lived. His heart raced at the possibility. Place a starting point. With the diary tucked under his arm, he descended the stairs, determined to follow that lead. The address took him to a nearby town, a community he had heard of but had never visited. Upon his arrival, the atmosphere enveloped him with its calm and welcoming air. Tree-lined streets and well-kept houses stood in contrast to the turmoil he felt inside. He paused for a moment, taking a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions that accompanied him. Like a detective in search of answers, Gale began to ask the residents about Salvador. Some looked at him with curiosity, while others appeared hesitant, as if the name was a distant echo of something they did not want to remember. He realized that people carried their own secrets and stories, and that perhaps Teodoro's past had left deeper scars than he had imagined. With each negative response, his hope waned a little, but his determination did not leave him. He knew there was a truth to be revealed and that Teodoro wanted him to discover it. In his search, Gale found a small community library, where he decided to research more about Salvador. The old books and newspapers were a source of stories that seemed to dance before him, intertwining with the past he was trying to understand. There he discovered an old local newspaper that mentioned a Salvador Pereira, a talented artist who had moved to the town years ago. The description of the man seemed to fit the image in the photograph Teodoro had left. Now there was a new clue. Gale began to investigate more about the artist, discovering that he had participated in exhibitions and art fairs in various locations. With that, the spark of hope reignited. But Gale's journey was far from being just a search for a lost uncle. It was an emotional journey that forced him to confront his own insecurities. The pain of losing his grandfather still accompanied him, and now the idea of finding Salvador brought a mix of anxiety and expectation. He wondered, what if Salvador did not want to see him? What if his grandfather's story was more complicated than he imagined? He resolved to continue. Teodoro's life was a puzzle, and he needed to piece it together. Each new discovery seemed to connect to the next, as if the universe were conspiring to lead him to his uncle. With the photograph and the address in mind, Gale headed to the gallery where Salvador used to showcase his works. The anticipation grew with every step. When he finally arrived at the gallery, Gale's heart was racing. He looked around, admiring the displayed works, each telling a unique story, but nothing compared to what he felt at that moment. He approached an attendant and, with a mix of nervousness and hope, asked about Salvador. The attendant smiled with a friendly expression but with a hint of surprise in her eyes. Salvador? He's actually here. He has a new exhibition tonight, she said. Gale felt warmth flooding through his body. He was so close finally. But at the same time, a deep fear enveloped him. What if reality did not meet his expectations? He took a deep breath, deciding there was no turning back. If Teodoro entrusted him with this search, then he needed to move forward. As he entered the gallery, a new chapter of his family's story was about to be written. While admiring the vibrant paintings adorning the walls, he remembered the letter, the love and secrets of his grandfather, and how everything was interconnected. The journey that had begun with a loss was transforming into a quest for reconciliation and understanding. And as daunting as it was, Gale was prepared to face whatever the future held. Thus, he made his way to the heart of the gallery, where the lives of two men, grandfather and uncle, were about to intertwine once more, perhaps finally finding the peace that both deserved. Gale's heart beat like a drum in his chest as he approached the room where Salvador's work was displayed. The atmosphere was thick with expectation, and each step he took seemed to echo like a call for what was about to happen. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside him. After months of searching and yearning, he was finally about to meet the uncle he never knew existed. As he entered the room, a wave of warmth and emotion enveloped him. Salvador stood there, gazing at one of his paintings, a vibrant portrait of a landscape that evoked nostalgia and longing. The gray hair and serene expression made it clear that he carried many stories and memories. Gale hesitated for a moment, feeling like an intruder in a world he did not know, but the force of destiny pushed him forward. "Uncle Salvador?" Gale called, his voice slightly trembling but filled with hope. Salvador turned slowly, and upon meeting Gale's gaze, his eyes widened in surprise. There was a glimmer of recognition, an instant connection that transcended words. "Who are you?" Salvador asked, a mix of curiosity and apprehension in his voice. Gale introduced himself, revealing the truth that had been kept secret for so long. He spoke of Teodoro, the letter, and the journey that had brought him here. Each word that left his mouth carried the weight of pain and hope. Salvador listened intently, his hands trembling slightly. When Gale mentioned that Teodoro had passed away, Salvador's expression changed, and tears began to slide down his wrinkled face. "My brother. I did not know," he murmured, the pain of a loss not only recent but also the absence of a bond for so many years finally overflowing. The two souls, once separated by pride and misunderstandings, were now side by side, each carrying the burden of their stories. Amidst the tense and emotional atmosphere, Salvador began to share his childhood memories with Teodoro, moments Gale could never have imagined. He spoke of the days they were inseparable, the laughter shared, and the promises they made to always be there for each other. But like many family stories, there were also shadows. "There was a time when we did not speak," Salvador confessed, his voice choked with emotion. A mistake from the past, something I thought was only mine, but that affected us all. I did not know how to find my way back, and because of that, I lost my brother. The weight of those words echoed between them, and the collective pain of the past merged with a newfound understanding. Gale felt his own heart break as he realized that behind every decision lay love and regret. He finally understood that the secret Teodoro had carried with him was not merely a stain on the family history, but an inexplicable thread that connected them. Tears flowed freely, and the two men embraced, a gesture of reconciliation that carried the hope of a new beginning. The past was still present, but now there was also a chance to redeem those lost moments. As they separated from the embrace, Gale looked into Salvador's eyes and saw a reflection of his own pain and joy. "We still have time," Gale said softly, a spark of hope illuminating his gaze. "We can share the stories that were never told and rebuild what was broken." Salvador nodded, his eyes shining with gratitude. The connection they had created was powerful, a bridge extending across generations, linking the past to the future. From that moment on, Gale knew he was about to enter a new chapter of his life, one filled with stories not just of loss, but of resilience and love. As they talked, laughter and tears mingled, and every word exchanged felt like a step toward a new mutual understanding. Thus, the meeting was not merely a reunion of two lost lives. It was a rebirth, an opportunity to rediscover not only the family history but also the story of each of them. With each revelation, Gale and Salvador were building a legacy, one that honored Teodoro and the lessons of the past while opening doors to a future together. What awaited them was unknown, but they were ready to face it. And as the shadows of the past began to dissipate, a new light emerged, the light of hope, understanding, and a reunited family. After the emotional meeting, Gale and Salvador sat at a small cafe table, their hands still slightly trembling from emotion, but now with shy smiles blooming on their faces. The strong aroma of fresh coffee mingled with the scent of homemade cake being served, creating a cozy atmosphere that contrasted with the weight of the revelations they had shared. As the steaming cups were placed on the table, both were immersed in a world that had, until then, remained unknown. Gale looked into Salvador's eyes, trying to grasp the essence of the man who had been part of his family, but had lived in silence for so many years. "Uncle," he began, his voice low and respectful, "Grandpa's letter speaks not only about secrets from the past but also about the importance of coming together, of healing the wounds that have separated us." Salvador nodded, his expression serious yet illuminated by understanding. "Yes," he replied, his eyes filled with emotion. "I always knew something was missing in my life. For all these years I carried the pain of separation like a shadow, an absence I could never fill." Salvador's words resonated with Gale, revealing the depth of the longing and loneliness they had both felt. They began to share stories about Teodoro, recalling the little things that made him who he was. The way their grandfather always made a point to tell family stories at every meal, how he always laughed at the simplest jokes, and the advice he offered, often disguised as fairy tales. Each memory brought forth smiles and tears, a tribute to the life of a man who had been an anchor in their lives. As they conversed, an idea began to take shape in Gale's mind. "What if we did something to honor Grandpa's legacy?" he suggested, excitement growing as he spoke. "A project that brings our family together, that helps others understand the importance of reconnecting and healing wounds." The suggestion made Salvador's heart pulse with a new kind of energy, and he smiled, his eyes shining with a glimmer of hope. "That would be amazing," he agreed, enthusiasm evident in his voice. "We could create a memoir, collect family stories, and perhaps even invite people who knew Teodoro to share their memories, not just of the good times but also of the challenges we faced together." This idea of reclaiming the past, compiling untold stories, and bringing to life a legacy that had remained hidden for so long became a common thread between them. With each word exchanged, a new connection was formed, a bond that strengthened as they opened up to each other. The fears and regrets of the past began to dissipate, making way for a new understanding and, more importantly, a new family bond. This project was not merely an act of reconciliation, but a way to heal the wounds caused by years of silence. Gale felt that he was finally fulfilling the promise he had made to himself to honor his grandfather while rewriting his own story. Each story they collected would not only be a piece of the puzzle that was Teodoro's life, but also an opportunity for others to find their own ways of reconciliation. Days turned into weeks, and each meeting between Gail and Salvador became a new adventure. They explored old photo albums, spoke with family members they hadn't seen in years, and even traveled together to visit places Teodoro had loved. Each discovery was a new chance to laugh and cry together, to share memories that would cement their new bond. By the end of this process, Gail realized that Teodoro's letter was not just a reminder that the past always accompanies us, but also an invitation for him and Salvador to build a future together. The pain of separation had transformed into a bond of love, and the wounds that once seemed impossible to heal now stood as witnesses to the resilience of family. On the night of the book's release, in a small ceremony surrounded by friends and family, Gail took to the stage with a smile on his face and tears in his eyes. He made a toast, thanking Teodoro's legacy, which was now alive on the pages of the book. And as the room echoed with applause, Gail knew he had finally found what he had been searching for. A new beginning, not just for himself but for the entire family. Thus, Teodoro's story was not merely about loss and regret, but about love, reconciliation, and the strength that family can have. Teodoro's legacy was not buried in the past but had become a light illuminating the path to the future, a flame of hope that would warm hearts for generations to come. With a new chapter about to begin, Gail looked at Salvador, knowing that together they could face any challenge life threw at them, always guided by the wisdom and love that their grandfather had left as a heritage. If you were moved by Gail and Salvador's story, and believe in the power of reconciliation and familial love, we want to hear from you. What are your own experiences with family secrets or unexpected reconciliations? Leave a comment below and share your stories with us. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more heartwarming narratives. Together, let's build a community where stories are celebrated and love is always remembered.